Hi everyone, welcome back to the pod and to our final episode of the season. What a season it's been. Can't thank you enough for supporting us. And huge thank you to all our guests who've really generously given their time, or anyone who sent in a story, shared an experience, liked, reviewed. Obviously, there's still a chance to do all of those things. You can reach out to us on @the NDA podcast, wherever you look up the people that you follow. We're going to go out with a bang. I know I say this every week, like, oh, this episode's been highly requested, but this episode really does rile people up. We're talking about pitching, the pros and cons, the highs and lows, and how it actually impacts the industry. We're going to be looking at it both from a creative point of view and a client perspective, which is a lens that I think we're often not talking about this through. So we've invited them into the conversation. That's where I'm going to bring in the pros. We've got some guests this week who are pretty well equipped to debate pitching, and they've got some pretty big opinions on the subject. So, Toby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. Firstly, thank you very much for having me. I'm Toby Wilkinson. I'm the co-founder of a business called Ask Us for Ideas. We're a matchmaker between brands and agencies, and we support brands at inflection points to find sort of brief, shortlist, and find the right agency partners. And our work really starts and finishes at the beginning of the pitch process. Call it that for the purpose of this conversation. That ends at the end of the pitch process. So I think I'm not a client. I would add that. But I obviously the important part of what we do as a business, amongst other things, is to represent both ends of the table. So to represent clients' desires and expectations and hopes, and also represent agencies and the way they like to go about business and winning business, and it's in finding those points of alignment where I think we do a good job of what we do. So yeah, as I say, excited to be here, very privileged to share this platform with Leo and Felipe. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. That's speaking of, guys, do you want to introduce yourselves as well?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Leo. I'm one of the founders and creative directors at Porto Rocha. We are a strategy and design agency based in Brooklyn, New York. And we've been facing quite a few difficult decisions when clients reach out and ask for pitches. And that's why we're here, to share a little bit more about that.
And my name is Felipe. I'm the other founder and creative director at Porto Rocha. And I guess just to add to what Leo just said, I guess we are also here because a few months ago we launched a new project, which was this initiative to the industry, call it No Free Pitches. And we got a lot of signatures from leaders from the industry, and we can talk more about that.
Awesome. Like I said, incredibly qualified, way more than me. But I'll introduce myself anyway. I'm Katie Cadwell, co-founder, creative director at Lucky Dip, and your host. My pronouns are she, her. And today I am also going to be sharing some of the many listener stories, submissions, opinions. We're keeping it real this week. Haven't edited out any of the slightly fruity language in a few of these. So buckle up everyone, because there's quite a lot to get through. I thought I might start with some statistics. So we asked on our Insta, have you pitched? Have you pitched for free? Have you pitched for paid work? And 83% of people have pitched at some point in their career. So I think it's pretty safe to say that a huge portion of the industry are affected by this. But the opinions that we see and hear are often are also often fairly negative about the pitching process. So I think it makes sense to start. We'll start in a negative way. Let's start with the cons. Everyone really wants to talk about it. So Toby, I'm going to start with you. Why do you think it's such a controversial topic?
I think it's a controversial topic, and I think it has been a controversial topic for a long time, as Leo and Felipe will know. It's obviously risen its head again recently, and I think it's a result of probably the kind of economic situation and the fact that there's less work in the market. If I think about just how the pendulum swings sometimes from our perspective, we see it where agencies hold a lot of the control because there's a lot of work out there and there's a sort of surplus of work to agencies. And then obviously we have negative economic times, and the pendulum swings again, and there's more agencies than there is work. As a consequence of that, agencies, to their credit, because they're fighting, will go a bit further themselves, and everyone pushes and goes a bit further until suddenly we find ourselves back in this position where the pitch has become more prevalent. And I think the controversy around it is this idea that people are being expected to do the work that they typically get paid for, and at risk of their ideas being used and stolen, and especially in a tricky landscape of agencies. And we suffer from this as well, where the ghost client is still a big, massive issue, and there's this expectation that people go do all this work for free. And again, I think it's part of the problem with the argument around pitching is often a lack of definition around the word pitch and what it actually means. And I think people jump to either end of the spectrum, either we don't pitch at all, or we'll do everything. And there's a lot of nuance that sits in between. And I think also there's the differentiation, which is what Leo Felipe's campaign was all about, between free pitching and paid pitching. And I don't think there's anyone out there that would disagree that at some point in time, certainly, and there's different opinions on how far an agency is willing to go and what a client expects, that it goes too far, and at this point people should be paid for the work. And I don't think personally that bit is controversial. I think it's just it's just the challenge of people have differing opinions, people are willing to go further. Some agencies don't mind pitching, some don't pitch at all, whether it's paid or not paid. And I think because there's varying opinions, and because people care about the work and it impacts them if they don't win it, and et cetera, it naturally is a controversial subject.
I think you've hit on a lot of the things that we've definitely been hearing from listeners and I want us to discuss today. So I think a little bit of context is really good. So Leo, Felipe, would you be up for talking about some of your experiences pitching? If you want to come straight out the gate and talk about your worst ever pitching experience, you're very welcome to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I before starting the studio, I worked in advertising for many years. That was the beginning of my career as a designer. And back then, in the old days of advertising, pitching was something that was very present in my routine. So I would often pitch for campaigns. And it was something that I would say that I learned a lot through that process when I was younger. And then later on, now as a studio founder, we noticed that, especially after the pandemic, pitching became something more prominent. And we do have a lot of stories that we can share.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point about the advertising culture. Ultimately, the pitching culture comes from advertising. But back then, when Felipe started his career, the financial model of agencies was completely different. People weren't really paying for service or creative time that was put in, but rather media placement. So pitching made sense because there's these $1 million accounts that if you put it on the scale, the creative work that's put into it is insignificant compared to the potential outcome. What we're talking about now is that this culture of advertising has kind of somehow infiltrated the design world, but the model is not the same. We're paid for our time, but clients have an expectation that we're going to work for free. So we're ultimately giving away our most valuable asset, which is creative work, strategic work, without being compensated for it. And I feel like there are very few industries where this sort of behavior is not completely frowned upon. And I think part of it is the fact that we, as an industry, haven't been able to kind of come together and speak up, and we're just kind of accepting it for what it is. And I think Toby's point about the pendulum swinging and how currently economically we're going through a tough time is such a good point, because it only exposes the fact that it's a power dynamic and it's a supply and demand issue. So whenever agencies have less demand, clients are willing to extract as much as possible. And we feel like a true partnership shouldn't be about that. It should be about valuing the work that you have to offer, valuing the final output, and doing the best work possible.
Yeah, and then also just going back to the advertising comparison, I do think it's very different pitching for a big idea for a campaign and pitching for the future of a brand, pitching for like brand strategy, where actually you need to have all the information that often you don't have when you are pitching. So I would say, yeah, the same process that sometimes my work for advertising definitely doesn't work for strategy and design. And to answer your question about the worst time that we ever pitched it,
There are a few.
There are a few, but I think for me, the one that I think the most is it was actually right before we decided to do the campaign. And it was a process where throughout the entire pitching process, the client was so happy with all the work. They were just,
Ecstatic.
every round of work that we did for free, they would just say how we were the perfect partners, how everyone was so happy with the work. And I'm talking about like big tech brand.
And
Not to name
also-
names, but
yeah, but
big
also
ones.
a big team on their side. We're talking about more than a dozen people on these meetings, and really high caliber work and really complex work as well, which in retrospect we should never be doing for free.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we thought, and this is where again the power dynamics comes in. They're like, look at this opportunity. This could be kind of like life-changing for your agency if you
Yes.
land a job like this. So they also understand this potential exposure, but behind the scenes they're talking to 6 other agencies, and ultimately you have no control of which agency is going to win regardless of the work you do.
Yeah, and they were
That's
not
a different topic that we can talk about.
they were not strangers, like they were people that I've worked in the past. So the whole process was very smooth, but then after they ghosted us for a month, and then eventually we didn't get the project. And then when we asked for a feedback, because always it's super helpful to talk to clients when they decide to go with another partner, just to know what we could have done better. And they just told us that they were too busy doing their work. So even like being available to talk to us for, I don't know, half an hour, it was too much for them.
But
So that was
I honestly
very
think this
frustrating.
point comes to show that ultimately, whether you get a job or not, is not up to the people you're presenting to directly, especially for these bigger pitches. It goes all the way up to the executives, and we don't really know what is the criteria for evaluation, whether like an executive will be more comfortable awarding a agency that has been around for 30 plus years, that has 100 plus employees, versus a smaller agency who maybe work-wise delivered a lot more. But in that split moment of decision, I have this idea in my mind that maybe is not how it goes down, but I feel like there's 3 folders that are like printed probably, and the executives just quickly look at it. They have like 5 minutes to make a call, like this one. Meanwhile, we just had a team of 10 people working for 3 weeks on this thing, and getting continued support from the direct clients. So anyways, I just feel like it's a really, this comes to the main point, I think, is like how unfair the system is. Ultimately, I think it comes down to that. If we had to simplify it down to one word, it's a really unfair process.
Totally. And I think that is not a unique, sadly, that's not a unique experience to you. So we had a story in from Rita Juarez, who basically was working for a really big fashion client, who they pitched for. They really dragged the process out for 9 months to end up ghosting all of their outreaches after endless decks of free work and meetings. So that kind of theme of a lack of respect for time, asking a lot of agencies, and ghosting is really commonplace, which is incredibly scary. And then the other kind of angle, which I think we've already mentioned, is that idea of IP and giving away work for free, and that is our currency, right? That's how we make our living. So someone on Instagram said they gave my concepts and idea to another agency to fill. So is that been all of our experience? Like, what do we feel about the IP in the pitching process?
For sure. That's a great question as well. And yeah, I think there's two answers to that. One is there's a difference between convincing you're the right partner through showcasing your thinking, showcasing previous similar relevant projects, checking the chemistry with the client, making sure we have the resources necessary to do a good job, and going ahead and actually doing the work. And I think that has to do with what Toby also mentioned briefly, which is that it's not an extreme of don't pitch or pitch, because ultimately we know that we need to instill enough confidence for them to trust their partner to potentially rebrand a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar company. And that's very different than actually proposing solutions in a really crunched timeline with no budget. And it almost devalues or undermines the amount of work that goes behind such complex challenges. Which is why when we don't pitch anymore, and that's why we came up with no free pitches. It was kind of like the last straw, but we still do a lot of work in these initial conversations we have with clients to convince them that we're the right partner. But we never propose unique solutions or design work or creative work because that's what we're selling ultimately. Sorry, that was kind of like a long way of answering the question, but just to kind of explain what I think about like the IP idea, because I've seen it firsthand, work that we've done come out in the world a little bit differently. Obviously, there's like some tweaks here and there, so you can't really flag it, but I'm pretty confident our work has influenced this.
Yeah, and it's
design.
a tricky question, especially when it comes to branding and design, because the solutions that we came up with, they're not based in one single gesture. It's a set of different ingredients. So sometimes you can see work that is inspired, but you cannot really tell.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a blurred line for sure.
Toby, do you feel a kind of way when you see an agency? I assume you're privy to some of the decks that get passed backwards and forwards between your clients and agencies. Clients that do creative work for pitches, do you have any opinion on that, or do you just not see that happen?
It does happen, and I go back to the point I made earlier, which is, are we talking about free pitching or not pitching at all and pay pitching? Because Leo Felipe just said we don't pitch, but that's not quite true. It's you don't free pitch, you are willing to pitch, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. In the early days of Ask Us for Ideas, when we were trying to build our business, we used to use a saying that, and one of the things that when we came into this industry, we started this business out of university, my co-founder and I. We'd never worked in the creative services industry in any capacity, whether an agency or a client. We had no personal connection, so we came to it from a completely blank canvas. And the first job we had to do was to get agencies to trust us and to be a part of what we were trying to do. Because really, in the early days, and still entirely today, we are only as good as the agencies we know and have relationships with. And the timing of us entering the industry was the kind of birth of the independent boutique, and at that time very specialized agency. And there's another conversation about specialized versus full service and how that pendulum swings again. But it was that moment in time where talent was leaving networked agencies and setting up specialist shops, and clients were following that. And the one thing that was a kind of constant theme in every conversation we had with agencies was, we've left big agency world, we're not pitching anymore. People are going to buy into us as individuals and the way we think and we go about it and our track record, and they're going to work with us. So our first flag in the sand was we represent the boutique agency, that's who we're celebrating, and we're not going to allow people to expect free pitch work. And the saying that we used to use when talking to clients was, agencies are very happy to work for the work, they're just not going to do the work for the work. And that's how we tried to differentiate the two things. not everyone's, still sticks to that. But I think that's the point that the guys were making, is like, no one's saying that, we're not, look at us, take it or leave it, we're not doing anything else. It's like people are willing to put in time and thinking and convince clients that they're the right partner, but they're also asking the client to trust in them and their process and their philosophies and to buy into that. And if a client doesn't want to do that, that's fine, but don't then drag people through a process and then ghost them. I mean, I could do a 5-hour podcast on ghosting if you ever wanted to. It's like, in my opinion, it's almost as bad, if not worse, than the whole pitching thing. I think, and the two things are synonymous, but it's there's definitely a lack of respect a lot of the time, for sure.
I think that's a really interesting, it's important for us to differentiate between the two, right? So let's park free pitching, because there aren't many people that would come out and go, I actually love free pitching, I love working for free, and I love not making any money. So let's talk about paid pitches. We have a quote from Jenny Powell, who is essentially saying that paid pitches lead to half-baked work and half-baked solutions. My bugbear is that you rarely have access to decent strategy, and so the creative can sometimes feel too instinctive / not big picture enough. So let's create a fake situation. Client comes to you, they're saying, okay, it's a 10K pitch for a 200K project. So, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to do some creative work. You don't win the work, but the work comes out in some form later on. Technically, they paid 10 grand for it, right?
No. They paid 10 grand for us to spend enough time to showcase our capabilities. They didn't pay 10 grand for us to do creative work that's going to go out on the street. There's a huge distinction there, and that's what I mean by the definition of pitching is a little bit up in the air, because you can think of pitching as you presenting yourself as an agency again, and being that first contact with the client to make sure that you check all the boxes that they're looking for. Or you can think of free pitching, which is the definition we entirely disagree with, as a sprint to get work done that's going to go out into the world. And that's what Felipe said earlier. The work we do requires a lot of time. These are complex systems with complex audiences, goals, business and communication and otherwise. So the expectation that you can solve those challenges in 2 weeks is completely unrealistic. So the quote you read from Powell, I think summarizes it perfectly. I would just kind of repeat what the quote said, and I think that is a great point.
Yeah, in that case, 10K, it's often not even enough to cost half of our operational costs doing the pitch. So it's a very symbolic money, but it's not really worth it for sure. And yes, even when it's a paid pitch, although sometimes we have to do it because that's how it works, I don't really agree with that process, because it's almost impossible to solve a challenge without actually knowing the problem fully. And the only way you know the problem is if you actually do the work, if you talk to people, if you have access to all the information that is accessible and is required to solve that problem. So in summary, I do think pitching, it's not the right process for the client, because it's terrible for us, but for the client, I don't think it's the most effective way of doing work.
I totally agree.
Yeah,
ultimately, what you're measuring is whether or not the agency or studio you're talking to, if they have disposable income and disposable resources to throw at this pitch. Which brings us to another point, which is that it's a very unfair landscape. Smaller studios have a huge disadvantage because they don't have resources to just move around. And when we were smaller, there's no way we could participate in one of these pitches because we would go bankrupt. Now we have a little bit more flexibility, but nonetheless, I don't think this should be even a criteria for evaluation in the first place. Which is why we're entirely against the creative pitching, paid or unpaid. Because those 10K that you mentioned are completely insignificant given, again, the amount of time and effort and our own resources. Like Felipe said, if we take on a pitch for 10K, we're going to spend all that money before we present.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Toby,
it doesn't
Toby,
really
I've obviously pulled 10K out of thin air. So I got two questions for you. I'll put you on the spot with one, which you can choose not to answer. What is if there is a price for a good price for a paid pitch, what is that? And then more broadly speaking, how do you feel about paid pitching and clients saying, actually, we're willing to put some money behind it, we want to see creative work for it?
So I'll answer the first question first, which is it's impossible to put a number on it because it depends on what's expected in return for the pitch. It's like a project as well. It's like asking me what's a good price for a branding project. Well, it depends on the studio, it depends on how much work, the process, the time, etc. So I think it's a hard thing to answer. That's me sitting on the fence there. That's my cheeky way of getting out of that. But just to follow on, I think the benefit of a paid pitch is, yes, on behalf of the client, yes, in a sense, you do get to you do get to feel how an agency thinks a bit. But the benefit on both sides is the process of actually working together. It is the first time you actually get to work together, but that's why it's crucial that if you are going to do a pitch, and I talk about this on the side of a client, you have to make it a process. It's not just go away and come back. You have to run a mini process. Whether that's tissue sessions, whether that's conversation, access to materials, multiple conversations that then build to the agency then presenting something back. Because I think you learn as much in that process of how an agency interrogates you, their willingness to ask questions, how they ask questions, and then how they respond to you based on those conversations is telling. And I think also on the agency side, it can tell you whether you like working with a client and whether that relationship is potentially a good one or a good working one or not. But also the big thing for me is I feel that if you are going to do a pitch, the end of the pitch should be a point in which you can move forward from, not have to go backwards from. So I always suggest that, and again, one thing, we're talking about branding here. I think it can be different in different skill sets, like skill kind of capability areas. If it is about a campaign and the agency has the brand has a really solid strategy and point of view and understands their consumers and their buying patterns and whatever it is, you can jump to ideas a bit. But in the world of branding, I completely agree with the guys in the sense that to present what ultimately would be the end of a 3, 4, 5, 6 month process after 2 weeks is ludicrous. But if you were to take, and this is sometimes what I recommend to clients, if they feel they have to do something, and that's their prerogative, if they have to do something to make a decision, they feel they need something to give them that confidence, is, take the first phase of the project and run a mini version of that with each agency, which is really a couple of sessions, immersion sessions, and at the end of that, each agency comes back with a presentation of thoughts based on those immersion sessions, and then you get a feel for how people work. You get some level of thinking. It's not the end solution, and whoever you select, you can then continue forward in the process, and you're sort of investing money into the total cost rather than investing money that sits on top of the cost. Because I always say, sometimes, I meet clients who have a tight budget as it stands, and then they're going to go and spend 20% of their whole budget on pitching, and I'm like, wouldn't that budget be better being put towards the idea or the thing or whatever you're doing? And so, I think if you are going to spend the money, it's really important you spend the money on a process. You'll learn more from a process that ends with a point in which you can move forward from, not in theory you have to go back from and rework and interrogate, but you're already stuck, And I think the last point I make on it is, the risk is, in certain instances, is as a client, do you want people coming back and just telling you what they think you want to hear to win the work, or someone who's going to come back and push you on how you think is right? And the risk is you just fall in love with the thing that you think you want to see, spend tens, hundreds, maybe $1 million on something, depending on the landscape in which you play, that ultimately isn't actually fit for purpose. And I think that's the real risk from my perspective.
That's actually a really nice way of looking at it, and I think very helpfully, a lovely segue to start being a little bit more positive and talking about some of the pros to pitching. So I'm going back to Jenny Powell, who said, as a designer in an agency, I think you're often really detached from whether it's paid or not and the kind of politics around those decisions. And so at times it hasn't been a direct issue. So the focus is always on doing the best work possible. My experience of pitches is that it's stressful, although often fun to break out of your regular client or brands that you work with could be a great way of flexing your creative muscles. Time is never enough, although that does sometimes force you to not overthink things and keep momentum. I've also had some good bonding experiences with the team on pitches. So I want to talk about the impact of pitching on teams. We've all done them. Sometimes you have an amazing pitch and you're all eating McDonald's in the studio at 10 o'clock and just talking about how good you are. And other times you get to pitch day and you're empty, completely burnt out, not particularly proud of the work. So what do we think the benefits are for teams, or what do we think the impact of pitching has on teams?
Well, I think first thing, I don't agree with her comment in terms of when you are a designer, you don't know exactly the process. Or for us, we always make sure to be very transparent with whatever is working on our side, and I do think it's super important for the designers to know what's the context, if it's a paid pitch, if it's not a paid pitch, to learn about the client. So the more we can be transparent in terms of all the information we have, we share with the designers, because it is super important for everyone that is part of the process to have that strategic perspective as well.
From a business side.
Yeah, if you're it's not just about designing, but it is about learning about the business and knowing what's the background. So in that sense, I don't agree with that. And
I feel like it's gonna be hard for us to talk positively about pitching. Yeah, what's good about it?
Yeah, and that mentality of let's take this challenge and have some fun with it. Let's use this opportunity. I think the goal would be to have fun with it during the whole process, when you actually get the work. I think this concept of staying until late at the studio ordering McDonald's, this is like over, this is like Mad Men mentality, and we are in 2024, and that doesn't just flow anymore. So it's really, really hard for me to agree with that concept, because I don't think that works anymore. And especially working with younger designers and the new generation of workers, that's really off.
Yeah, and to that point, I feel like working late isn't necessarily, let's say, the end of the world. I've worked late my whole career, and things have shifted for the better, obviously. But I do feel like personally, as a designer, especially when I was a designer under many other people, the things that motivated me or the things that justified me putting those hours is guaranteeing that the work I'm doing is for a real project and not the chance of potentially landing this job. I feel like on top of that, it's really stressful. You're straining yourself. It can lead to burnout. And on top of that, you don't even know if you're going to get the project. Yeah. And as you know, if you don't get the project, that means you can't talk about it publicly. You can't put it in your portfolio. So it's kind of like a lose-lose situation. Again, I'm trying to look at it through a positive lens.
It's fine. I knew you guys weren't going to feel particularly positively about it. I really wanted to say this point, because we did hear from juniors and mids that they felt like pitching was a real fun break for them, and they might be pulled off some of the slightly more boring tasks to pitch in for a couple of days, really learn a lot, and that kind of speed and change of pace was super interesting for them. But I am going to move on to talking about why pitching exists. Like, why is it here? What do clients actually want from a pitch, and what are they looking for? So I've got some anonymous clients who we asked, what are you looking for in that process? So the first client gave some really interesting points. They're looking for fast alignment on the brand challenge, that feeling that they just get it, and that knowing that they're going to really enjoy working with that team and that agency. They've got the skill sets and the talent to match that brief, so they're looking to see proof of that. Prior work to showcase that they can they have the potential to actually deliver. And then showing great challenges and questions on the brief. So I guess an alternative point of view maybe on what they might have come up with themselves. So Toby, I wanted to ask you, is that true in your experience? And what do you think clients are looking for in that process? And then I think this is when every agency owner is going to lean in. How do agencies kind of do that? This is like, we're looking to you for the answers here. Like, what's the magic formula?
Yeah, I think, I hear what that client said in the way I hear it, which may be how he or she intended it to be heard. But I think sometimes clients and agencies are actually more aligned than they think they are. But because the word pitch is used, it then suddenly creates this kind of like, back off element. We don't pitch, well, we want to pitch. But neither party has actually asked what each other means by a pitch. And it's just a kind of immediate assumption. Because when I hear what that client said, we want fast alignment, we want to understand their process and how they've done this before. Actually, a lot of that can happen without any sort of creative pitch, paid or unpaid. Mm-hmm. And look, agencies, the last thing I want to do is kind of generalize on agencies' behalf, because actually there is no, agencies have differing views on this, and some, thought starters or per point of view on their sector or their audience, or other companies in their land, that they compete against, and how they go about whatever they do. Some agencies are willing to put together sort of instinctive thought starters, provocations, but these are, again, I go back to that point of, they're not the final solution in any capacity. Mm-hmm. They're just showing to the client that they have a viewpoint, and they have an approach generally in how they work with other clients. This is how they do it. This is the results of the work they've done before. And agencies are willing to put time in to kind of convince them of that, which the guys said at the beginning, they're not willing to spend time on this process. And actually, when I hear what that client says, I think it's actually, there's closer alignment than we think in terms of what the agency is willing to do and what the client needs to see to be done. Now, that doesn't mean that I'd still think at a certain point that should be paid for. And I go back to the point I made on the last question of, okay, well, what's the process then, and what's the end point? How do we move forward from that end point? But I think, I didn't hear from that client them say, well, we need to see the idea. Yeah. We need to see the thing. And I think that's the key point there.
Yeah, and to clarify, I think that's exactly right. Everything you listed from that quote, Katie, I think are things that we're willing to do as part of this first contact with the client. Mm-hmm. So of course, showcasing relevant work, asking questions about the brief, diving into the brief, and bringing in provocations, thought starters. All of that to us fits into this sort of initial presentation that we don't consider pitching. And then we can debate whether or not this initial phase needs to be paid, but in our minds, because we're not really solving the problem, but we're more like interrogating the brief and showcasing our critical thinking, that's a fair, I think, expectation. Sure, there's a lot of time that's put into it and some level of financial investment, but we have no problem doing that because we also understand, we're talking about like high stakes sometimes. And to answer your previous question, I think ultimately it all comes down to risk aversion. And especially now that design and branding, it's more than ever such a significant part of contemporary brands. And a lot of times the people that are hiring us directly, they want to make sure they don't fuck up, basically. Because, well, the future of the brand could be at risk, and also their jobs could be at risk. So a lot of times they want to make sure basically that they're making the right decision, and I think that's entirely fair. We're by no means saying you should blindly pick your agency of choice based solely on reputation.
Yeah, if I was on the other side, I would also want to know more about the people that I'm going to work with, that I need to trust. So for sure, I agree with Leo and Toby. I just don't think pitching is the right way to do it, especially because most of the times it's very common that the same people that are working on the pitch is not necessarily the people that we work on the project. So for us, I think there's a lot of emphasis in just showing who we are, what we believe, who are actually the people behind the work. Me and Leo, that we're going to be very present throughout the process. So those are things that for us is super important to share and to tell the client. And one example, Sundance, which is probably one of the most successful projects that we have, it was exactly like that. They came to us, they asked for a pitch. We said no. We presented thought starters. We talked about the brand, our perspective, our point of view, and that was enough for us, for them to trust us.
I think it can backfire too on an agency's part. They can pitch and actually not win the work as a consequence of, because they've shown them something that they don't think they want to see, even if potentially that is the right solution. And then they end up going back to the agencies that didn't pitch and say, actually, we want to work with you. And so I think it's really important that I always try and frame to clients as much as possible, because we spoke about the power dynamic and the struggle earlier in the conversation, that like I feel that the client is to a degree, and should always be, based on respect, pitching the agency to be a client for them. It's not a one-way decision. It's not a client walks into an agency and they want to work with them, they get to work with them. An agency has a right to decide whether they want to work with a client as well. And the process, to a degree, and that's why maybe the benefits of a process that the guy spoke about, where there's proper conversation and provocations and discussions and a willingness to challenge and push each other and discuss, is finding fast alignment, as the client puts it, is actually really important for both sides of the table. This is not just about the client finding alignment with the agency. The agency can benefit from a good process like that as well, where they go, actually, do you know what? We saved ourselves 3 months of hell there, because actually we just weren't aligned with that client. And however much we wanted to work with the client, actually we see things in completely different ways. And so I think a good process, a good pitch process, and I use the word pitch as a general term for winning work, can really benefit both sides of the table if it's done well. And the work and the relationship and the trust and the confidence in one another is really vital going forward, because not every process is also perfect from start to finish. There are points where a client might see something they don't like or weren't expecting, and actually where there's trust and belief, that can be a really good point in the process, even though it's a bad thing in theory, because it allows for constructive feedback, and if you break something you can fix it better. So, but if there's no trust, or like it's just like we're the client, you're the agency, or vice versa, when things go wrong, the relationship falls apart. I always say an agency is only as good as their client, and a client is only as good as their agency. It's not one or the other. And too often people go into a relationship thinking, just by virtue of working with this agency, we're going to be successful and we don't have to do anything. And I think that's the riskiest place to be. So a pitch process can be good if it is respectful of both sides. It allows people to really get to know one another, to push and challenge and see, whether there's kind of strength and trust in the relationship, and the relationship can be really powerful moving forward, because everyone believes in it and has conviction.
Obviously, that's the dream scenario, right? And that's what we're all trying to get to. But you do still have clients who are requesting, right, to see creative work. So they want to see all that, and they also want to see a little bit of creative work. And that might come from a place of, like you mentioned, Leo, that might come from a place of pressures from their point of view. I think really often we're not thinking about it from a client's point of view, and what do they need that work for, and where is it going? So we did ask another lovely client, anonymous, do you feel the need to see creative work from agencies before committing to working together? And they said, absolutely. Even as a launching point to ask questions from, personal recommendation isn't enough, because every business has different requirements, needs, asks, audience, internal processes, and implementation strategies. So how would all of you go about going back to that client and kind of saying, no, you don't need to see creative work, or explaining to them why that's not necessary, and kind of, I want to say, kind of abating their fears and, how scary it can be choosing a partner?
Yeah, for sure. That's a super tough question. First of all, this reminds me of a classic situation we run into, which is clients that ask for a pitch presentation, as Toby was saying, in general terms of pitching, and they say, we're not expecting creative work, but dot dot dot, whatever it is. And it creates this horrible situation where they're not necessarily imposing, but other agencies will take that and present creative work. So immediately you have a huge disadvantage. And
In this case, he was honest. At least he said absolutely. So
yeah, no. In this case, yeah. In this case, it's
expecting.
absolutely, which is not what I was expecting. I was like, oh, it's gonna be the classic. Like, we're not expecting it, but it's always nice to see. But yeah, I think that happens a lot, and ultimately, whether or not we present creative work, I think it takes advantage of competitiveness between agencies as well, which to me feels almost like unethical, to be super honest, where and very often they don't disclose who are the other agencies that are working with you. Sometimes they say how many, but not always. So you don't even really know what your chances are or who you're competing against. And it's a completely blind process. I wish we could see all of the agencies' pitches. This way, at least there's a transparency. We know who's coming in with what. Maybe it's going to appease a lot of our frustrations if we don't get it, because I can be the first one to be. Sometimes we lose a quote unquote pitch, and I'll be the first one to say, you know what? I feel like, as Toby was saying, it wasn't going to be a right fit. I'm sure they found someone that is more aligned. Or not, or I'm going to be extremely frustrated and say, I cannot believe we didn't get it. Like, what we presented was so perfect. What happened? And sometimes we ask for feedback and we don't get it. So I don't know if I answered the question. I went a little bit on a tangent,
Yes.
But I was just like, I just had this thought in mind that I had to get out.
Yeah.
Because I feel like ultimately it goes back to the pendulum. It's the industry, the client side taking advantage of an industry that is in need of more projects, and it creates a super competitive environment, when I think we shouldn't be pitching against our peers, our industry colleagues, and studios and agencies that should be on our side. I think we should come together, and that was the main driving force behind nofreepitches.com. was I felt like our industry was starting to compete against each other in an unhealthy way. And the clients are just up there like watching the battlefield. And I was like, we need to come together and fight back, Maybe that's a bit aggressive to say, but I feel like if we don't say something is wrong, we need to show that we also have a say. And another point is, very often the clients are coming to us. They see value in working with us. And we sometimes forget that. And we put ourselves in a position where we need them so much, especially under these economic circumstances. But they need us more than we need them. Not always, because there's the financial.
I don't think it's one or the other. But anyways, I think to answer the question about that client, if he really wants to see the work, I mean, it's exactly what Toby said. Is he willing to be part of the process? Is he willing to share all the information that we need? Is he willing to pay what is fair for us to show the work? So yeah, I think if that's something that we definitely need to do, we need to work together, and we need to be compensated for that work. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and the answer to your question, sorry, just so I don't completely ignore what you asked, is the way we would go about it is say, so here's the thing, we can do a presentation where we'll take you through who we are, our vision for this challenge. We'll kind of like dissect the brief, everything we just talked about. We'll bring thought starters, which are relevant to your industry, your kind of competitive landscape, behavioral observations, and provocations, or potential paths forward, or where we think there's an area of opportunity, where are the main challenges that we identified, where are the opportunities we identified, how we think a rebrand can be beneficial, but without giving the solution. That, to me, is where we draw the line. And if they're willing to accept that, great. If not, that's also great, because it was not meant to be. The challenge is, like I said earlier, sometimes they're going to say, okay, that's fine, but there's another agency who's willing to put in the creative work. And they have a much higher chance of being awarded for that. but it's almost like taking a shortcut and not thinking about the real challenge at hand, which is the business or the client needs versus landing the job needs, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The work we do takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of interrogation. And whatever we propose in 1 week, 2 weeks is not going to be it.
Yeah, it's always that dilemma, right, that Toby was just saying, like, are we going to show what the client wants to see versus what we feel it's right?
The right solution, yeah.
So, and we always, I mean, we should always show what's the right solution versus something just to impress and to win the project. But we're always in that situation, always, constantly.
There's like a level of almost client education, right, in that piece. So if a client comes to you, Toby, and they're like dead set, we need to see creative work, we're willing to pay for it, find us the agencies are going to do that. Do you try to convince them that that's not the right way to do it? Do you let agencies convince them that that's not the right way to do it? Or do you just find them agencies that are willing to work on pitches?
Yeah, we will always question why they feel they need to do that and hear their reasoning. And I think depending on, I go back to that sort of, are we talking about a rebrand? Are we talking about a social campaign? There's instances where I can understand maybe why you could jump to the ideas a bit quicker. Maybe the ideas can be the start, the platform to move forward, rather than in the case of a sort of logo, to call it that. And brand is much more than that. But like this idea that they want to see like a logo is like, that is it's almost such a last piece of the puzzle, if you see what I mean, where the beginning is of an idea for a social campaign, like a sort of thought on a page, can be a jumping forward point. So I think there's and look, our job, as I said at the beginning of this, is to represent the client's desires, educate them and challenge them and push them to think differently whenever we can. That's always part of the value we try to bring to the table, but also not be judgmental on behalf of necessarily all agencies, but use them as a gauge as to what they're willing to do and give them the opportunity to go for the things that they want to do, as long as there's always like transparency about, from our point of forward, how many agencies we're putting forward, who else is involved, and defining on the client side that I think, to the guy's point, there has to be a really like clear process here that sort of everyone's doing the same thing to a degree and everyone understands kind of what the expectation is through the process, and a commitment as you as a client to give them the time and they need to sort of deliver on what you're asking them to do. And I always think if a client's not willing to give the time, then why should an agency? But at the end of the day, it's a client's prerogative to decide what they want to do. There's no obligation for any agency to take part in that. And as long as there's really clear lines of expectations and deliverables and a fair process, then for some agencies they quite like working in that way, and that's their choice, that's their philosophy, that's their approach. And we try and represent all agencies in terms of how they want to go about work. And I suppose it might be for a young agency that piece of work that they on paper might not have won, but suddenly win because they come up with a great idea and it can define their studio. So there is a place for it from time to time, and good things can come from it if it's carried out in a way that's considered and trustworthy. And whether a client follows through with that is always the challenge. But we try and create a space as an organisation to allow every client to be who they want to be and represent themselves, and the same on the agency side. And it's about finding those points of alignment, and hopefully we can play that educational piece on the side of kind of helping the client to go about this in the best way possible, and we can help ensure there's transparency through the process. As I say, it's it's an agency, clients. I understand the perspective of someone who's working in a big organisation where there's pressures, and how this project plays out might be what keeps their job or doesn't keep their job and defines their career going forward. So I understand the pressures, but again, try and get people to also try not to put their whole job line on this project, because that is like if you're putting so much pressure on this thing, that's going to filter into the project itself and the process. And actually, probably you're going to it's not going to work out that way. So, use a process to build trust, to get to know agency, to have conviction in them, and really know with 100% confidence that you're moving forward with them because you really buy into them, and then the work will be good. 95% of the time, and it certainly won't be very bad, and it certainly won't lose you your job. I don't want anyone coming after me for saying this, but that's kind of our belief basically. So I'm blabbing here, but
no, you're not.
Educate clients where we can, but also support them to do the things that they feel they need to do to make the decisions.
I think the thing that we keep stumbling across is it's such a grey area, and this word pitch is maybe actually not the quite the right word for us. So clearly defining the deliverables and setting out really clear expectations, right? But as an industry, we're incredibly competitive. Leo, you've already talked to this. It's burnt into us that we should always over deliver. If there's 5 deliverables in the scope, we're also showing a shit ton of merch. Or, okay, we really want to win the launch, so we're going to show them loads of launch ideas, right? We over deliver as default. So how are we going to define pitch when there's always someone who's going to be a little bit competitive and try and get that competitive edge and is willing to over deliver? That's how we've ended up back in this place, right?
Yeah, but I think the competition shouldn't be about the amount of creative applications that you're going to deliver and who brings the most insightful work, who brings the work that has more potential to grow, that you can see that has legs, that has, you can see the future of a brand in that deck. And that often is not necessarily like the coolest design, or it's not something that it's so superficial. It's more related to the core of the project, which is the strategic thinking. And sometimes people get it, sometimes people don't. But I think that should be the way to review the work and to see who has the best work.
Yeah. Well, to add to that, we are definitely guilty of over delivering, which might seem counterintuitive to everything we just said, but it's very different to over deliver once you already have a signed scope of work and you have that exclusive relationship with a client that trusts you, that we're on the same boat, we have the same goals in mind, versus over delivering, not to make sure you're doing the best work, but to make sure the other agency doesn't get it. I think that's the big distinction. And yeah, unfortunately, the pitch process, now I'm talking about the pitch process as in presenting creative work. The work is mostly designed for you to secure the job and not to solve the challenge at hand. I think there's just simply not enough time for you to solve those challenges. And I think that's where the problem lies. Honestly. Yeah.
I feel like, Toby, you've got like this amazing position in the industry where you do get to see all the decks from all the studios. We'd all give our right arms to get a pitch presentation from every agency in the land. Of the stuff that you've seen, is it about equal what people are, the kind of work that people put into a pitch? And I don't mean that necessarily they have creative work, but the amount of effort that people put into proposals, is that about the same across the board?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think it's important. The way I put it is, I think it's important. I spoke about if there is a pitch, there's a sort of clearly defined process, and everyone's sort of singing from the same sort of sheet, effectively. At the same time, the process should allow for individuality. We don't want to create just a Play-Doh machine where every agency sort of comes out looking the same. It should leave room for people to interpret things in the way they want and go further here, or someone lean more into strategy, someone lean more into design. So I think, there's always going to be an element of that. I think it has a place. I think it allows people to show their individuality and their willingness to do stuff. But at the same time, I completely agree with what the guys are saying in terms of just sort of doing things for the sake of trying to win the work. I don't think benefits the agency, and it certainly doesn't benefit the client. So it's a tricky thing, because once you do it, there's always going to be someone that maybe does something a bit different. I think the other big risk to the client is, we're quite visual beings, and as soon as you start showing visual stuff, people forget often what the reason they're there. And actually, a brand's issue could be a strategic one, a positioning one, an audience one. And actually, in looking at beautiful visual things that they like, they forget that the real reason they start this project in the first place, which was, yes, ultimately a design need, but it's not necessarily just design that is the issue with why they're not succeeding or why they're facing a current challenge with their current brand. It could actually really be a strategy piece, a positioning piece, a messaging piece, and I think the risk is that in the excitement of a visual presentation, you can actually forget the very reason you started this project in the first place. And I think that is another issue with, a potential issue with the process.
I think we've all seen that. Let's put some jazzy visuals in and distract them from the fact we haven't had much time to work on it. I want to talk about the consequences of being very, very open about the fact that you don't want to pitch. So obviously, guys, after the petition went out, have you seen a change? Do you feel like you're missing out on clients? Has the caliber of clients changed, or is your inbox empty? Like, what's going on since it went out?
I think actually there's a lot of very tangible change, with a few exceptions of clients that were a little bit out of the loop about the whole nofreepitches.com, and they requested pitches, and we just responded by saying, so we just started this initiative, here's the link so you can understand why we don't do it. For the most part, we realized there's a bit of a shift in that dynamic, as we were saying earlier, where first of all, some clients are very straightforward. They're like, we're not looking for a pitch, we're just looking for a presentation with thought starters and whatnot. So that was the first shift that we noticed. We very rarely heard clients kind of acknowledging the whole pitch process so kind of like clearly. And yeah, I feel like honestly, even if it's not extremely clear, the benefits of that, I feel like the initiative itself goes way beyond just our impact as Porto Rocha, but a much kind of like wider industry-wide initiative. I think having people sign that petition started lots of conversations all over the world, at studios big and small, and tough conversations that people were kind of just putting to the side. So, and that was the intention the whole time. It's how can we, no matter how incremental that change is, how can we make the industry a little bit more fair, for lack of a better word.
And of course, yeah, as Leo was saying, change is incremental, but just the fact that we are here talking about it, people are, it became a conversation topic that already means so much to us. And yes, I think I'm excited about the next month and see how that goes. But so far, yeah, super happy with the response, and definitely we don't regret.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we've heard from designer friends that they knew there were meetings taking place at agencies, like executives coming together to discuss whether or not they could sign the petition, or designers signing it without consulting with their higher ups and then getting in trouble, which I think is all interesting because it makes it very clear that one, it's a very political thing. It's very challenging. It's not, like we said, it's not black or white. There's a lot of gray area between not pitching for free. What are you showing the pitch? Is it creative work? Is it not? How much are we supposed to be compensated for a pitch? There's a lot of nuance. So I hope that us taking a very strong stance against it doesn't mean that we're like gonna judge anyone that does a pitch. I think, yeah, it's very complex.
Yeah, and that's important to say because it's interesting because when we posted about it, we saw a lot of comments that were like things like, "Oh, I'm proudly never pitched in my life," and for me that comes from such a privileged position, because so many times pitching is the way you get in. Pitching is the way you are able to get into a new industry, for example. And yeah, I feel it's a bit arrogant just to have that perspective, because we know that as a studio we are, like, still in a very privileged position to be part of the 1% that is able to work with huge global brands, but we know definitely that's not a reality in most of the studios, especially in other cities, not like New York, London, and so on. So it's super important to acknowledge that as well, that saying no to not pitching, saying yes to not pitching comes from this privileged position, and we don't want to be that type of person.
It's not about judging if you do it, because we understand the motivations. We've done it ourselves many times. But it's not about judging, but it's about having this conversation and hopefully changing the industry practice.
Yes. Because it's not simple. A lot of people say, "Oh, it's so simple, just don't pitch." Yeah. And I don't think it's that simple.
No, it's not.
I think there's so many things.
I'm really glad you guys have said that, actually, because we did have a few messages that said, and anonymous messages, because I think there is this kind of fear of judgment, and they said it's a real privilege to be able to say no to never pitching. What if you've got a studio full of people with no work on, and you need them to be doing something, and we've got mouths to feed? So I want to move on a little bit to what's next. Obviously, you've started a position, you've got the signatures. What happens after that? And I wanted to be very candid about trying to find people. I'm very grateful you're all here. I'll say that before I say this next thing. Trying to find people to come onto the podcast and talk about the fact that occasionally they do have to pitch. And we know that they do. We know that agencies are pitching. My DMs are full of pitching stories, and they're not from the 90s. So should we be calling agencies out? Why are agencies lying about it? Are people signing the petition and then going back to working on a pitch? I feel like that's fundamentally one of the problems in this issue.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's hard to hold anyone accountable because you don't know until you're really living through it on the agency side. If, let's say, like you said, we don't have enough work, we're a little bit desperate. It's hard to say no when there's an opportunity or the chance of an opportunity. But yeah, ultimately, I think it goes back to what Felipe was saying. There's an unfair sort of playing field where huge agencies have those resources to put onto pitches that are not guaranteed, but a lot of the small ones don't. And I think honestly it would be much easier for the big ones to take a stance because the impact that they're going to have is much greater. And to a certain extent that's what we try to do, being like a medium-sized studio agency. But at the same time, I don't feel like it should be like a witch hunt, you know? Like we said, it's really hard until you go through it and you make that decision. Our position is to take a stance against it.
Yeah, and if you go on our website and you search for the names that are not there, I think it's easy to realize who didn't sign.
Yeah, there are a lot of agencies that do not sign, which is fine too. There's no problem.
Yeah.
Do you see a trend, Toby, in like the types of agencies that will and won't pitch? I'm not asking you to name names, obviously, but I mean like small versus big, or long established versus slightly newer agencies.
I don't know that we do. And firstly, I just to answer your original question, I definitely don't think we should call people out. At the end of the day, there's no right or wrong way to go about this. People are totally entitled to go about how doing things however they want. And you know, if someone feels that they're the way to kind of get themselves going, or there's an opportunity on the table that is just the perfect opportunity for them, it's meaningful, it's good value, whatever it might be, then, you know, credit them for, you know, being hustlers and fighting for stuff. But I agree, I think, you know, I love that the guys have taken the stance. I think it's important to drive the conversation again. I think there's a deeper conversation to have around how we define what a pitch is and what is free pitching, what is pitching. But in terms of the trend we see, I think there's probably two answers to that question. One is smaller agencies that are trying. Look, we don't. To start this, we also don't work with the big networked agencies. We work with boutique agencies. Some of those boutique agencies are sort of 100 people strong. Some are 2 people strong, and they're sort of everything in between. But they're boutique, in the main, independent. 99% of them. Probably the ones that are willing to pitch are ones that are kind of smaller, earlier in their journey. Ones that work in sort of advertising and more campaign-led. We could go back to the point this all started in advertising, and that's where it is most prevalent. And then there are some agencies, I think, who are just, their whole philosophy is about instinctive creativity rather than, deep strategic, philosophical kind of approaches. Again, both approaches are right. It's really important clients buy into agencies whose process and philosophies they buy into. And in those instances, some of those agencies quite sort of thrive off that idea of putting ideas forward, but they are in the main ideas rather than the solution. And we go back to that point of ideas and people giving sort of ideas to people actually giving the solution. So I think highly sort of instinctive, creative teams that sort of instinctively jump to creative ideas more so than others. There's always an element of that. Teams that are trying to kind of have just set up their agency and are trying to break in. And then probably the big agencies where it's much more prevalent. But as I say, we don't work with them.
Awesome, thank you. I'm about to wrap us up, and I'm going to read our last anonymous story. You'll notice there's a lot of anonymous stories in this particular episode. Pitching, it's bollocks. Everyone does it if the fee is big enough or if it's famous enough. Everyone. So I have a question for you all. Do you have a project that you would throw your morals away for? What would that be? As an example, if Beyonce goes on tour with the Cowboy Carter album and needs backing visuals or an identity or merch, I'd probably do that for free. So do you guys have something that you might bend your stance for?
I love that question because I think, yes. To be a total hypocrite, yes. I feel like there are things that if they show up, like we would make an exception to the nofreepitches.com.
Do you want to put them out and manifest them into the world like I've just done?
Honestly, I don't know. I haven't really thought.
I don't know. I think the only thing that comes to my mind, for example, I think the Olympics. I don't want to work for free, of course, but I do think in that case, if you work on Olympics, it is interesting to have the opportunity to show different perspectives on the same work, considering you are representing a country, and in that way, I do think seeing different options and creative routes would be beneficial, because I think the idea is it's a really big event that requires a lot of different perspectives. So I would say that would be my dream project. But besides that,
identity, right?
Yeah. But besides that, I think even for Beyonce, she has money.
I know.
So
I mean, the Olympic Committee, they're so rich. That's what we're talking about. Definitely, like brands that have a lot of money that we would because we do work for free, of course, for nonprofits or pro bono projects for causes that we appreciate. Yes. But I guess that's not what the question is.
No.
But yeah, I like the answer of the Olympics, just in terms of the global significance and the reach. Beyonce as well, we're Beyonce fans, so I think
I wouldn't work for free for Beyonce. I don't think so.
I might do a little bit. I might do a t-shirt.
I'm sure at least we would have a tough conversation at the office, and everyone would be involved. And like, what do we do? Yeah. Maybe, and I mean, I'm not to name names, but naming names. Can I?
Yeah,
Is this
can.
cuts at all or no? But last year FIFA reached out for a rebrand, and we were already like right off the bat. We were like, okay, we need to make sure that this project really means like real change for the institution, just given all their they're passed, and halfway through the first initial meetings, they're like, it's going to be a pitch. And I was like, honestly cracking up inside, not in front of the client, but inside I was like, oh my God. The combination of working for a massive institution that really needs help kind of repositioning themselves and fixing all of the controversial past they had, plus the pitch is just insane to me. But anyways, just like a random story that I added in. I don't know if is the podcast gonna be cut at all?
we can edit that out if you change your mind.
The name of the podcast is NDA, so
yeah.
I don't think...
I'll think about it. I'll think about it, and then if I change my mind by the end of the day, I'll send an email.
Okay. Toby, is there a client you'd love to work with that you might waive your fee for? Because it applies to the role that you have in the industry as well.
Luckily, I'm not talented. Well, unluckily or luckily, I'm not talented enough that anyone would want me to do any sort of creative work on their behalf. So I've never faced with that challenge. But and that we don't have a financial relationship with brands. So there's we don't ever have to pitch, if you see what I mean. So I'm in the privileged position where I'm not the one that ever has to do the pitch or at risk of doing the pitch. But I know, speaking to agencies of all sizes and shapes, that there's always a project that they'd love to work on. You know, for a long time it was airlines, now it's space travel, it'll be something else in the future. There's always that project, there's always that willingness. But it does pain me. That when it's like the companies that can afford it the most that get away with it. It's always, for me, it's like celebrities get free meals, and it's like that. They can afford meals. Like why do they get it? But it's just the nature of the world we live in. So I think there's always exceptions, and that's, again, I go back to the fact that there's an individual nature to every agency, and their individuality is what defines them versus another agency, and it's their decision as to whether they want to go in for a project or not, depending on the expectations, is entirely up to them. And what we always try and do is first educate the client where we can to try and do things in the best way possible, represent their interests, but then go to the agencies and say, this is the state of play. It's your choice. Is it something that excites you enough? Do you want to know more? And if they do, great. If they don't, totally, that's totally understandable. And we always say that our agencies and the agencies that we work with, and agencies in general, are run by good people, people that care about the work they do, that care about the world. And we always say we're in sort of a quite privileged position that we can use our agencies as as a barometer as to what's right and what's wrong. And if every agency we go to says no, we're not working with that sector or that client, then we think that's a pretty good direction. But one person's client, we'd never work with them because they represent X, Y, and Z. It can be another agency's dream client. And so it's to be non-judgmental, but also to where our agencies take a stand collectively to represent that stand. And that's how we look at things anyway.
Yeah, just such good answers. We're going to put that question up on our socials. What is the project you would bin your morals for? So head over there if you're listening still to us at this point, and let us know what that dream project is. And if anyone from Beyonce's team or the Olympic Committee is listening, then call us. Can I
just add, if I was talented enough, mine would be Manchester United. So if Sir Jim Ratcliffe is listening,
we'll send him your way, and then you might be like, "What am I going to do with you?"
Connect them with us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
okay. I'll pass it on.
I'm so grateful to you all for having this conversation, because, like I said, it's a really heated topic. And I think this conversation that is actually a little bit more open-minded about it is just so beneficial and so helpful. So thank you so much. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it. And that's it really. Thanks for being on the pod.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.